Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I am Cari and this is my talk, An Indie Approach to Accessibility. So before we kind of get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about me. So I am Rebellion's Senior Designer of Accessibility, and I was formerly the UX designer at Puny Astronaut. So I started at Rebellion in March of this year, so it's been a fairly recent job change. So I'm here to talk about the kind of work that I did at Puny on their title, Skye Tales. So Skye Tales is a gentle puzzle exploration game, which is about the player playing as Skye, the friendly dragon, who floats through the world and helps the denizens with their various tasks and completes quests. The game is kind of built for kids and casual gamers, and with the Nintendo Switch and other consoles in mind. And this kind of talk is about Puny's journey with accessibility and the approach that they took with it. So to kind of kick us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this talk's going to contain. We've got section 1, which is from 0 to 40 plus features in 4 months. So this is all about identifying accessibility features and developing the tools and systems that was needed for them. The second section is what we couldn't do, so what we couldn't fit into the 4 months, and a few reasons why you should consider accessibility up front. And also the last section is about how successful we were. So looking at accessibility user testing, how we validated our features, and the kind of feedback and changes that we made from the testing. So listening to this, your kind of takeaways will be how Puny got started with accessibility, practical examples of why planning is absolutely necessary for accessibility, and also how and why you should validate your features from an indie kind of perspective. So bear in mind, this is just kind of one perspective. This is looking at how me working at Puny approached accessibility for the game, having not a lot of experience with it already. So without much further ado, we'll get started on the first section. So Skye Tales and Puny Astronaut was my first job out of uni. So my focus was primarily UI UX, and the game evolved a few times while I was working there. At one point we started looking at launching the game, but instead we were presented with a bunch of feedback and an opportunity to build the game into something greater, looking at how to improve the gameplay, the user experience, and also just features over the course of about 3 to 4 months. And one of the things that had kind of been neglected up until that point was accessibility. So this was an opportunity for us to have a look at what have we got in terms of accessibility, what could we be building on, because we want as many people to play this as possible. So that brings us to our first kind of topic, identifying accessibility features. So I was kind of in charge of this, and I'd always considered the very basics of accessibility, color blindness, contrasting text, but I hadn't really looked beyond that. And this was mainly because of imposter syndrome. I was thinking to myself, how do I know if I'm doing this right? I don't know where to start, I don't know where to look, I don't use these features, so I don't know if what I'm doing is working. And the kind of biggest fear for me was putting time and effort into designing a feature to solve a problem or to break down a barrier for someone, but then for that solution that I'd made to not actually solve any problems, or worse, to cause more. And that's kind of what I was afraid of. And as I'm sure that you all know, there are incredible accessibility resources out there, from the Xbox accessibility guidelines to game accessibility guidelines, the special effect dev kits, and the AbleGamers APX cards. But I started here at the Family Video Game Database, which is also known as Taming Gaming. That's how I usually talk about it. But yeah, this is built for parents and guardians, and it's kind of meant for them to go and have a look, see what kind of features games have, and really understand if a game is something that's going to be suitable for their kid. And this list of their accessibility features was incredibly approachable for me, because it was built for parents and for people who didn't really have a lot of the technical lingo. Obviously I had those skills because I had been working in game development for an extended period of time, but I didn't know where to start with accessibility. So seeing them kind of laid out really clearly with really plain English made it a lot more approachable for me. So this is where I started. I was reading through the list, I was picking out the goals that I wanted to achieve, and I found that some of the things that were listed there we already had. So we went from having no idea what kind of capability the game had to already ticking boxes for some things. A lot of the things that we saw there were kind of building blocks and kind of stuff that we had already done for colour blindness, for example. It had been kept in mind, but it hadn't really been thoroughly checked. So there was kind of more work that would be required for some of those features. So that kind of brings me on to what we did to develop those new tools and features. So we did an awful lot in 4 months, and some of our biggest achievements were with the kind of visual accessibility side. So I'm going to talk a lot about that. I will be talking about some other things as well, but that's kind of going to be the focus of the features that we developed. So, colour blindness. Mentioned it before. It's one of the big four, and it was something that we had thought about while we'd been putting together art assets, but it hadn't been checked thoroughly. So we kind of started looking at places where it may be an issue, and the tech artist actually created a debug tool for us to apply to the game, which we could also do on the Switch console, and we'd be able to kind of preview what it would look like in different types of colour blindness. And this was really, really helpful because it was a tool that I could then brief QA on how to use and tell them what to look for. So I briefed them on how to do this. I gave them their kind of list of test cases, and they returned a list of areas for me that were lacking support or that could potentially have issues. So one of the things that came back from this was this lizard puzzle that we had in the game. And you have this lizard, and he is different colours depending on what he wants to eat. And there's 3 fruits that are about the place, one that is blue, one that is red, and one that is yellow. And the lizard is one of those colours. And we noticed that there wasn't actually any kind of support for colour blindness in this. We have the fruit, but they are all the same shape and just different colours, and the lizard as well was only differentiated through the 3 colours. So we went back and had a look at what could be done, and the solution that we came up with was to change the fruits so they were all unique shapes, and to add a kind of contextual clue into the crown of the lizard. So this is a work in progress screenshot of like, these are the 3 fruits, and this is kind of like the crown and how we're exploring having that additional reinforcement. And yeah, this was the kind of thing that we then applied to a lot of other puzzles as well, where we saw the same issue come up, was, okay, how can we relate it to a pattern or a shape, and therefore make it a bit easier for people to understand the correlation between those two. And I mean, these changes that we made for colour blindness were really good for doing that, but it's also just good practice in terms of having additional visual channels to communicate information, especially because we were designing a kids game. If we wanted it to be as approachable as possible for kids, then using not just colour but also shape was helpful for adding extra layers of correlation to the puzzle elements. Something that we spent a lot of time on and a lot of resources on was our high contrast mode, which I'm actually really proud of. So the high contrast mode was a kind of feature that was inspired by Last of Us, Ratchet & Clank, and it was just about applying a filter to the game so that it could be more accessible to people with low vision or with visual impairments. So as part of the high contrast mode, you have a sample scene set up where you can kind of see the player, a NPC, and a bunch of objects. And then the high contrast mode, turning it on, allows you to customize colors for each of those elements. So the player, key object, and NPC. You also have the ability to customize the background brightness, so you can change it from very, very dark to very, very light, which is especially helpful for if you struggle with low vision and the background elements can sometimes muddy things. Having it at one of these 2 extremes really strips the background out, so it's a lot easier to kind of see what the key objects are. And we have full customization over the colors that you can choose for the player or NPC or object. So we have a color wheel that you can operate and just set it to whatever works best for you. And this was something that was really important to us, is making sure that it was as customizable as possible, so that each user could tailor it to their own needs. As well as the high contrast mode, we had a desaturation mode, which we kind of developed alongside the high contrast, and this just applies desaturation to the screen at varying levels of intensity, and you also have the option to apply a tint over the screen as well, which again is just operated through a color wheel. And this tint color also applies to the UI. And this was something that we kind of wanted to make sure would happen, because with various visual or cognitive impairments, some people could find it easier to read off of different coloured backgrounds. So giving them that extra layer of customization and potentially making it so that the UI was easier for them to read was something that was quite important. Some of the non-visual things that we did for Skye Tales was to implement a dynamic tap and hold system. So in the game, we have a function where the player can pick up objects, for example this bucket, and move it around on some rails. You also have some free move objects as well, which aren't stuck on rails. But the way that that worked in terms of operating it from an input perspective was that you would hold down the trigger and it would initiate the tether, and then when you let go of the trigger, it would break the tether. And this wasn't particularly accessible for people who have strain or other kind of motor impairments. So we looked at creating a dynamic system where if you were to tap the input, it would initiate the tether, and then if you were to tap the input again, it would disconnect the tether. But if you were to press and hold it, it would still function the way that we had previously established it. And this was just built so that players could use whatever was most comfortable for them. So that's kind of why we went down the dynamic route. A few other features that we did or made sure to implement were things like using color contrast analyzer to ensure that there was good contrast for text and UI icons. And this was just a case of going through various screens and checking worst case background value versus worst case text value and seeing, okay, is this passing all of the contrast checks? Does it need to be changed? The other things that we did included expanding our hints, reminders and prompts. So we kind of looked at making sure that we could reduce cognitive load and make it as streamlined as possible. For people who have been to develop, you may be familiar with my talk, Skye Tales, a UI that couldn't be happier to see you, and that was around the premise that it was a gentle game that didn't want UI because it wanted to be as immersive as possible. So kind of having that breakthrough with our hints, reminders and prompt system was something that was quite big for us in terms of, okay, we're going to have a lot of pop-ups on screen which are optional, but it's there to help the player. And these things are kind of represented like this. You can see that there's a character icon that is associated with the hint, which says, help Elaine to grow the flowers for the festival. And this kind of reminds you that this area that you've come into the range of is related to one of the main quests. And that's also something that was important. As this kind of big open sandbox game, you could encounter any of the puzzles at any point, and only in certain areas had we managed to kind of put it so that it was a linear path. So by having these contextual prompts that would pop up, it would help to remind the player that this is something that's important to the core quest line if you want to do it. But it was a passive, non-intrusive reminder. So if the player wanted to do it, they could, or they could fly away and do something else. In terms of the hint system, we implemented this by having little in-world signposts that you could go over and speak to initiate some dialogue. And this is an option which is on by default, and you can turn it off if you don't want them, but we hide it behind an extra click to make sure that players understand what these hint signposts are. Something else that we worked on was separating out the audio into as many different levels as possible so that people could customize it. So this involves just taking all of the audio and separating it out into music, ambient sound effects, gameplay sound effects, and we also had UI sound effects in there as well. And this just means that people can play with the mixing. Maybe they want the gameplay sound effects to be louder, or they want to turn off ambient. It could be distracting. It could be that they want a clearer cue of like something that is interactable. But this was the kind of, these were the kind of other changes that we did to kind of add features to the game. So that kind of brings me to the end of the kind of brief list of stuff that we did. Obviously, as I said, we went from 0 to 40 features. Some of them were things that we already had, some of them were things that required extra work, and some of them were brand new features which we built specifically because we had the time to, and we thought that they would have a high enough impact. But of course, having only 3 to 4 months to work on things meant that there were things that we couldn't do. So what were those things? Narration is one of the kind of big things, and it was kind of a problem for us because the Switch didn't have any screen reader support at the time that we were looking. We did reach out to Xbox because they had narration, menu narration on Minecraft Dungeons, so we asked how they did that, but they were using their own tools that weren't available publicly. But ReadSpeaker did announce that Switch support would be coming in 2022. Haven't kept up to date with that. Maybe it's happened already. Fingers crossed it is either happening or has happened. And yeah, that's something that, you know, we wanted to have, but even if we'd known about screen reader support that was available, we probably wouldn't have been able to implement it in those 3 to 4 months. Because it is quite a hefty task, and this is something that requires like implementation much earlier on. Full controller remapping was something which is the most impactful option for motor disabilities, but it was something that required too many changes to systems code for us to fit into the schedule. What we did do instead is that we tried to support as many controller types as possible. So in the case of Switch, that's single Joy-Con, both left and right, dual Joy-Con, and the Pro controller. And through this, we aim to give the player as many options as possible in the interim before control remapping can be implemented. Text scaling is one of the big four, and it was just a case that it was something that hadn't been planned for. It would have required an entire overhaul of the UI so that things were dynamic and could expand properly, and as much as that was a skill that was learned later on, it wasn't something that was kind of in the UI from the get-go. And when we reached this 3 to 4 month window, that wasn't enough time for us to redo the UI completely to accommodate that, which is really disappointing. It could be something that is implemented in a patch. It depends how long they're planning on supporting the game and running updates for it. But yeah, text scaling is just something that needs to be considered really, really early in development, especially when you're doing your wireframes and your UI, because otherwise it's very hard to kind of shoehorn it in. So hopefully me talking a bit about the things that we couldn't do in those 4 months at the end of development will help you to see why you should consider accessibility up front. Puny is hoping to release an update with a bunch of these features and a few other things as well, but that's better than nothing. But obviously, because we didn't consider accessibility early enough, we weren't able to get features in for launch, which really should kind of be in launch. But it's a learning curve, and this was the approach that we took, is that, you know, we were a new studio, we were learning what we were doing, we had the opportunity to look at accessibility, and we've tried to do what we can. We've done an enormous amount, and we have an enormous amount of stuff in the back catalogue that we want to bring out as well. But if we had considered it earlier, we would have gotten so much more out of it. So that's kind of one of the messages that I want to drill home, is that it is never too late to be looking at accessibility. I mean, we looked at it like when we were thinking about shipping the game, and then suddenly we were given this opportunity. That's when we started seriously looking into accessibility. And yeah, it's never too late to start looking, because even if you can just do a few things, that is better than nothing. And the other thing that's really, really important as well is to publicize the features that you have available and the features that you don't have available, because that's going to help inform your players. Can I play this game? You know, does this game have features which are going to meet my capabilities? So this kind of leads me on to the last part of my talk, which is about how successful we actually were. So right back at the start of this process, I told you that I was worried about how to validate these features, because as someone who doesn't experience any disabilities, I wasn't best placed to validate them. And this is when we sort of looked to accessibility user testing. And this was great for us. We found contacts through the AbleGamers Charity, and they were an amazing service. And especially from an indie perspective, there is a free tier which was perfect for our needs. And the team at AbleGamers do a fantastic job. They are so friendly and so helpful, and they just make the entire process really, really approachable. So yeah. So in terms of what we did, because I had a background in UX, I was able to use my kind of user testing training to run these testing sessions. And we went with observation and interview. So we took the players that we got back from our recruitment, we put them through a screening survey, and then we kind of picked out players that would show a range of sort of views for the game. Thankfully, we were able to get enough players that kind of each of the four major sort of categories was covered multiple times. And this was just really helpful in terms of getting different perspectives, because one person's motor impairment is not going to be the same as somebody else's. So having that range is really important for building an accurate picture. The process of actually getting them to play the game and give feedback was really casual. Got them to play the game for about 45 minutes and just chat through what they were doing, and then at the end asking them if there was anything that they found difficult or challenging. And we got a lot of really, really good positive feedback from that, and a lot of really good constructive feedback. And one of the things that's really fantastic is that they were able to validate some of the features that we'd put in and say, this is working or this isn't working. Without having that validation from the players that need these features, it's difficult to judge whether or not it's going to actually help. So it was really important to actually have players experiencing disabilities as part of our testing and our feedback process. And also to make it iterative. Have a round of testing, make some changes, have more testing, see if it's improved. Get new people in, get some old people in, see what if they're still experiencing the same issues, or if the change has actually helped. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific pieces of feedback and the changes that we did. So one of them was to do with movement. We only had movement on one stick, and we have very light controls. So we have the triggers, the stick, and the face buttons. And players said that they wish that they could have movement on the other stick and the D-pad, because they might experience fatigue in one or both of their hands. So by having movement on both of the sticks, it allowed the player to switch over thumbs if one was getting fatigued. But also the D-pad is an entirely different kind of input, which may not cause the same strains as a thumbstick. So this was kind of a change that we implemented. And then kind of iterative feedback that we got from that is that the D-pad was really great for long distance moving, but short areas where there was more precise movement could be done through the thumbstick, but just for those kind of short periods of time. One of the pieces of feedback that we got was on the dynamic tap and hold system, which we had developed and implemented. And this goes back to me saying, I don't want to build something that tries to solve a problem but then causes more of a problem. And this is exactly what happened here, is that the dynamic system was far too sensitive for some players. It was a case of they didn't have the motor dexterity to press the trigger for a short enough period of time for it to register as a tap. And we did discuss a few things, like having a slider for how sensitive the tap would be, but then it actually raised the question of, why do we need a dynamic system? Why do we actually need to hold this control down? We, as developers, were familiar with that behavior because it was what we were used to, but realistically, we didn't actually need it to do that, and a first-time player isn't going to know the various iterations of the game that has happened before, so we just got rid of the hold functionality. Everywhere that we could, we just put in either toggles or taps, so it doesn't matter how long you hold down the trigger for now, it will still just register as one initiation of that input. So yeah, that's something that we changed, and it wasn't as terrifying as I thought it was going to be. I was really happy to get this kind of constructive feedback on something that I had designed and gone, okay, right, it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to try and build something to fix a problem, but as I said, getting that validation and getting that feedback was a really critical part of that process, because we were able to go, right, we've tried to fix this, we haven't fixed it, right, what can we do to actually remove this barrier? And finally, I'm going to chat about the feedback for the visual filters. So we did a round of testing which was specifically to look at the visual filters after we'd developed them and after we'd had a couple of rounds of general testing, and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and I'm so proud of it because it was a joy to watch players experience the filters and to say how much it improved their experience within the game. So it kind of broke down to 2 out of 3 players would use the high contrast mode. It was preferred by them, and they found that the filter was really customizable and it helped to show which elements were and weren't interactable. The high contrast mode reminded one player of like a dark mode because they turned the background kind of right down, and they said that they use dark mode a lot in applications to reduce eye strain. So that was something that we hadn't thought of, but ended up being a positive. One player noted that it was kind of a shame to lose out on the colour, but that they would still use this filter over others. We got a lot of praise on the desaturation mode as well, particularly from an aspect of not losing out on the background, but being able to play with the values a bit. Again, relating to eye strain, one of the players found that the colours were a bit too bright, so having the desaturation mode on actually helped in terms of reducing discomfort. And the kind of other piece of feedback that we got was that operating the menu was really easy to do. That was something that we had focused on a lot, is making sure that it was nice and simple, that when you went into a colour wheel there wasn't any other information to muddy it, and just to make sure that working it was intuitive and that everything was nice and big and readable. And players really loved the level of customization that they had over both of these filters, because it could tailor it to their own needs and their own experience. So, I've talked a lot about what we did and our approach, and hopefully from this you have met these takeaways. So, how Puny got started with accessibility for Skye Tales, why accessibility should be considered up front, but that's absolutely not a reason why you shouldn't get started with it right now. And also how and why you should validate your features. So using user testing, going back to the gamers that need these features, making sure that you're including them in your review process so that you're designing these things with these players in mind. So I'll stop talking now Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you have learned something or enjoyed this, or even if you haven't learned something, that it's just been interesting to hear a different perspective and hear the kind of indie approach of what we did when we addressed accessibility. I think it's fair to say that accessibility is one of my passion areas. That's why I'm now doing it full-time at Rebellion, and it's incredibly rewarding, and I'm always looking for opportunities to learn, and I think that's one of the biggest things that I can say as well, is that you are not going to get everything right the first time, and maybe not even the second time or the third time, and you don't need to tick every single box. It can be very overwhelming to look at a big list of accessibility features and go, oh my goodness, I need to do all of that. But we're still learning. Accessibility is new, relatively, in the game space, and more than anything, I just want to try and encourage you, if you are an indie studio and you haven't really considered this stuff yet, that get out there. Go and have a look at what you've got. Go and see if there are some low-cost things that you can do for accessibility wins. There are so many fantastic resources out there, and the other thing as well is that the community is lovely. There are loads of people that would happily chat to you about how to do a certain thing, or the way that they've approached something, or using a specific tool. So go out there, do that, and yeah. On that note, you can also ask me if you have questions or you just want to chat accessibility. I'll be hanging around in the Discord, but I'm also on Twitter. I never tweet anything because I'm incredibly anxious, but I will be looking at messages, so feel free to @ me or message me. And yeah, would love to hear from you. Have a wonderful rest of the conference, and good night.